Howdy, howdy, everyone. Welcome to Yale Center for British Arts online series, Artists in Conversation. My name is TK Smith, and I am currently art of the African Diaspora Curator at the Barnes Foundation in Philadelphia. And I'm delighted, I'm honored, I'm humbled to be joined today by the amazing Sonya Clark. So give me a second to get through some housekeeping things. Before we begin, I have to tell you that this program is being recorded and your camera and sound are muted and will remain so throughout the program. We'll be using the Q&A feature and it's located on your navigation bar down there and to gather all of the questions. So just send them through anytime throughout the conversation and there'll be space for Q&A at the end. If you need closed captioning, there is a live transcript available. Also, you can be accessed through an icon on your navigation bar. Yale does a land acknowledgement, and I actually just learned that there's a practicing land acknowledgement last night, which is where a percentage of the proceeds of programs that are ticketed go toward those communities that are mentioned in the land acknowledgement. I thought that was pretty cool and pretty radical. It was a queer maker space that was practicing that. So I will go ahead and read Yale's land acknowledgement, which is that Yale acknowledges the indigenous people and nations, including the Mohegan, the Mashantucket, Pequot, Eastern Pequot, Chagacok, Golden Hill, Passagut, Niantic, and the Quinnipiac, and other Algonquin-speaking peoples that have stewarded through generations the lands and waterways of what is now the state of Connecticut. We honor and respect the enduring relationship that exists between these peoples and nations and this land. And now I get to tell you about Sonya Clark. Clark is an African-American artist of Caribbean heritage. Intersections of textiles, flags in particular, and hair are reoccurring materials in her work. Through these, Clark celebrates Blackness, reclaims freedoms while interrogating historical and contemporary injustices. Her work is grounded in the exchange of stories and the transmission of craft techniques between individuals, communities, and generations. She is known for collaborative artworks that honor hairstyles, center marginalized communities, and incarcerated individuals, and hold space for the grief of communities hard hit by COVID. Clark lives and works at Amherst and is the Winifred L. Arms Professor of Art and Humanities at Amherst College. We are currently celebrating the closing and soon to open at the High in Atlanta. We Are Each Other, which is her second mid-career large survey exhibition, the first being Tatter, Bristle, and Mend, held in 2021 in her hometown of DC at the National Museum of Women in the Arts. And if you can believe it, We Are Each Other is her 60th solo exhibition, and what is highly indicative of incalculable labor, community labor, labor with materials. It is one of her over 500 exhibitions in her career so far. So I welcome you, Sonya Clark. Thank you for taking this time to be here with me and the folks at the Yale Center for British Arts.
TK, I just want to thank you so much because there's so many artists doing good work and you selected me to be in conversation with. So I'm deeply honored by that and really grateful for the what has so far proven to be the beginning of a great friendship. So thank you for making this space for us to have this conversation, and to the Yale Center for British Art for making this possible.
It is a no-brainer. I am, if nothing else, just a big old fan. So I am just excited to be here. So let's get started with some questions. Let's get into the work. And I'm sure what many of you out there are wondering is why we two Americans of the Americas, we could say, are speaking here at the Yale Center for British Arts. And the first thing to provide context into that and what kind of connects Sonya and I is that we both kind of deal with these kind of colonial inheritances or the kind of legacies of not only, chattel slavery, the transatlantic slave trade, but also the historical creolization, cultural influences of, and the results of just America's history that is so closely tied to Europe's and specifically Britain's. I mean, my last name is Smith. And so, Sonya, I wanted to ask you, how do you contend with that legacy and that inheritance that we are dealing with and living in the wake of now?
Yeah, I mean, I think that, there's monarchy and the empire of the British Empire. And I think about how the wealth of that empire would not exist without Black people, simply would not exist without Black people. And how whiteness in Europe, after ravaging the globe and taking all the resources, still manages to center itself. And marginalizes the majority of the world. And so I think about what legacies this leaves for us, and also how we're tangled in them. And so I'm going to share a couple of works as we're going through this conversation. And I wanted to really start with, as TK said, I'm a child of Caribbean immigrants. My father was from Trinidad, and his family is also, that side of the family has some Barbadian roots. And then my mother's from Jamaica. And my mother's maiden name was McCarty, which is a Scottish name. My great-grandfather, her grandfather, was from the Highlands of Scotland, and he made his way to what was then part of Britain, Jamaica, and in 1870 married my Black great-grandmother. And so my mother and that side of the family hold this name, McCarty, which was the Scottish man's name. And I wanted to make a piece that talked about these heritages. And so what you see on the top of the slide is sugarcane, which is what brought my great-grandfather and my great-grandmother and several other people to Jamaica for one of the cash crops of the time. So in this image that I just put up, you can see that this is a tartan, and you see my family in this tartan as well. There's a little swatch in the bottom left-hand side of the slide that is of Scottish wool of the McCarty tartan. But the big roll of cloth that you see there, and what you see my family, my beautiful McCarty part of the family holding up is this tartan, but instead of it being made out of Scottish wool, the McCarty tartan is actually made out of bagasse, which is the fiber that is left when you squeeze out all of the sugar, right? So you've taken what you need and then you leave the rest. So in this sense, it is this kind of metaphor for the British Empire. You'd like take the resources and leave the rest. But in the rest, there still is this legacy. And so I use that fiber, a bagasse, or the sugarcane fiber, to make up the McCarty tartan. I thought I was actually making a little piece of our heritage, a little cloth to sort of honor this complex, tangled legacy. And it turned out I was making a monument to something about who we are and how we are in the world, the complexity of identity in my family.
I mean, that is absolutely amazing. And I think really exemplary of why you are a material culture scholar's like dream. Like, you are interrogating the actual material and fiber, the touched, grown, commodified, traded, transnationally shipped material and symbolism, like this beautiful marriage of what these materials become to us beyond their physical utility, right? And so, like, just a dream. And that's how
TK, like the hand, and by this I mean like the cloth and the drape of the McCarty tartan that I made, it's better than Scottish wool. Like, it feels better to the touch. So I just want to also add that in there. And then I thought that when I was making this piece that I was going to go around the globe where my family diasporically lives and take these images of elders. And it turned out that my aunt died, and I brought the cloth to her funeral, and my family just snatched it up. And to this day, there is not a formal image, but there is a zillion of these images in everybody's cameras. And it's a requirement that this cloth come to funerals now.
Oh, wow.
Yeah.
Building traditions
I get
in
in
real
trouble
time.
if I don't bring the cloth. right? They want the cloth there more than they want me there. Yeah.
Can you talk about why it expands? Why it's much longer than a kilt?
It's actually not, it takes a lot of cloth to make a proper quilt. I mean, a proper kilt. So it's not much longer than a kilt would be. It's a little wider, but it was just that I wanted it to be something that could wrap around the body a little bit more akin to the way that you see like kente cloth wrapped around people, right? And in this case, it becomes like this scroll that everybody can hold on to. You see, my family is with it with such pride, right? And I just believe that it is a cloth that holds our identity, as I believe cloth has the power to do.
And it's complex and tense, and that is the kind of interesting mixture, that tension, that complexity, that nuance that I feel like is indicative of the diasporic experience and these colonial inheritances. And I wanted to ask, because, you know, in my research as a cultural historian and as a curator, I spend most of my time contending with these on the landscape. So I'm usually thinking of big physical, penile-like monuments that erupt from the landscape and interrupt sightlines. You know, I'm usually thinking of stone. I'm usually thinking of marble, gold leaf to a certain extent. And in your practice, you have taken on the same, and in calling this tartan a monument, but also in imbuing other material as monument. And I want to speak specifically about your treaty cloth work. And where that comes from and how it's doing a similar thing.
So I'm just going to give everybody a little bit of background, because people are, I'm hoping that people in your audience might be familiar with this work now. If you are, I'm going to take a lot of credit for that, because as an artist, one of the things that we can do is get images out into the world. So in 2011, I was given a Smithsonian Artist Research Fellowship, which is this fantastic fellowship where you're invited as an artist to go to the Smithsonian and do research and play and have it influence your work. And I found myself at the American History Museum. This was July, so everybody was in my hometown of Washington, D.C. This long line circling out outside of the Star-Spangled Banner. But there was an exhibition upstairs about presidencies and material culture objects. So I saw the top hat on the left, right, which I assumed was Lincoln's top hat. So I sort of navigated my way. Top hat called to me, and I was correct. It was Lincoln's top hat. And then next to it was this cloth on the right that I had never seen before. And it was labeled as the Confederate flag of truce, the surrender flag that was used in Appomattox on April 9th, 1865, to end the Civil War. And I immediately had this question, like, why don't I know this cloth? Why don't we all know this cloth? Why don't we know the cloth that signaled the potential end of white supremacy? Instead, we know one of the Confederate battle flags. And you can see it's just half of a dishcloth, so it was repurposed on the battlefield, went from domestic space to battle space. As a repurposed dishcloth. They couldn't find a completely white flag, so it has these 3 minimal red stripes. And it's half of the cloth because during truces and surrenders, people tend to cut the surrender cloth in half. And this half is what is at the American History Museum. So I then went about, and there you can see it's a Confederate truce flag. So then I went about making it whole, making reproductions of it. This is one that is true to scale that you see on the left, as it would have been on the battlefield, wrapped around the pole of a broomstick, and then carried through the battlefield. And then on the right, you see one that it looks very large, and it is actually 100 scale of the original. So it is 30 by 15 feet. Also made out of linen, everything upscaled a little bit. And that piece in the foreground is called monumental. And then in the background, which is a little hard to see, it's a piece called Many, and that's 100 true to scale ones. And I just was trying to get this out into the world. Like, what does it mean? What would it mean if this were what we held in our minds? This symbol of the end of white supremacy, the surrender of white supremacy. So I'm going to go through a couple more slides until you stop me, TK, okay? All right. So in the very back, you see this red wall, and the vestiges of white supremacy live on in this world. We know this to be true, and the Confederacy live on in the United States of America in such impactful, subtle, and disturbing ways. So the team at the Fabric Workshop and Museum who helped me put this together, when we were putting the show together, we had this big white cloth and these lots of white cloths in this big white space. And the director of the museum at the time said, we need, it's a lot of white in the space, which is funny, right? It's a lot of white in the space. And I said, we can always solve that with color. So why don't we color match those red stripes and make a point of focus wall? And when they went to color match, they went to Benjamin Moore, which until this point I had held in esteem as a paint company. They have fallen to the depths of my regard, because when they color matched, this is the color. I did not make this up. This is actually the color that matched the best. Benjamin Moore in 2019 had a color chip called Confederate Red that they referred to as a timeless and enduring classic. Here is a color chip. I'm hoping everyone can see it properly. I want you to note that they tuck Confederate Red between cherry wine and raspberry truffle as if it's a confection, as if white terrorism is a confection. This kind of propaganda is so dangerous. It's so dangerous in our world. So more for me to go about doing this work. I invited people to do reconstruction exercise. As a teacher, I believe if you get people to collectively make and embody practices, that's a different way of learning. So here you see a couple of people at looms weaving these long, elongated truce flags, these scrolls. Some people learning to weave for the first time, and their first weaving experience is weaving the image, this monument to the end of white supremacy. And then this one where I'm asking people to, this one is called lesson plans. People are sitting at these retrofitted desks that have been etched with the truce flag and rubbing. And I love this idea of them resonating in their body, rubbing this wax on this black paper, Tyvek paper, so that they can make truce flags to take with them. So, whoops. So this project is one in which I'm trying to get in people's minds, like, what does it mean if we constantly centered surrendering white supremacy in this nation, undoing white terrorism, pushing back at all of that, as opposed to Confederate Red is like a confection, right?
Yeah, and I mean, one of the things that I find most interesting about the intersection of the symbol of the Confederate flag and the materiality of your project is that, you know, I find sometimes that actions are monumental. I think what Bree Newsom did at that state building was monumental. She got up and
Absolutely.
she took a symbol and turned it back into material. And when it's turned back into material, as you have done in your own practice, you can turn it into its fragments and you can repurpose those fragments into something else. But just as your Confederate Red Wall kind of shows, that the way that this symbolism has permeated our culture and the way that it is so common to us. I mean, the high school I went to in St. Louis, there was a plantation in the back. You know, it's so common. It's so much a part of our lived experience every day that it sometimes becomes synonymous with what our American experience is, and therefore builds our American identity. And it's so.
Oh, sorry, go ahead.
No, please.
One could argue that it's baked in, right? And I'll show some pieces later that, white supremacy is baked in. And we actually have to undo that to get to a true multicultural, multi-ethnic, and just true democracy. I also want to say that the project was called Monumental Cloth because I think that cloth, in fact, is monumental, and I will attribute that to an artist who taught me that. And we'll get to that at the end, but this notion that you could have a hunk of metal or a piece of stone that is carved to celebrate, let's say, wrongly celebrate a Confederate general. I lived in Richmond, Virginia, so there was a whole Monument Avenue was a whole street of insurrectionists to the Union who were celebrated. So as those statues come down in places, that's one thing, but in our minds, we still have this Confederate battle flag that lives burned in our brains because of propaganda. And that kind of monument, that sort of psychological monument, is something that I think I'm trying to push back at with this truce flag. Like, let's replace this with the other. And what does that mean to hold in our minds? Of like, are we decentering whiteness? Are we undoing white supremacy now? That, as opposed to this really disturbing notion that the Confederate flag is about rebellion and somehow also about patriotism, right?
Yeah. And, it's so clever to combat a flag with another flag. And the flag, this is in fact the flag that says, it undoes all the lost cause myths, like the South will not rise again. You actually did give up, you actually did lose. And that puts a cap on a kind of fiction and a kind of fantasy that is fueling all of this. I mean, even that color red is visceral. I think even the gesture of the Confederate flag has a kind of impact on my body when I'm walking down the street or when I see a car pass me.
It's intended to terrorize. It's intended to terrorize. Yeah.
So thank you for that. And I would love to, since you previewed the next slide already, talk about this collaborative project you've done with incarcerated individuals.
Yes. So I like to think about freedoms, because that supposedly is one of the things that our nation is founded on, and yet we're the nation that incarcerates more people than anyone else. So this disconnect between, America, the land of the free, and also America, the land of the incarcerated. So this is a project that I did with many individuals, and some of them were incarcerated individuals. I asked people to sprinkle seeds. So that's what you're seeing in the sort of paint palette on the left. Sprinkle seeds, vegetal seeds, seeds that grow into food that we eat, on cyanotypes. And cyanotypes are early, they're early photographs. It's the same process that we use for early blueprints, right? So thinking about the blueprints of this nation, like the blueprints of freedom and who gets to be free and who doesn't. I was thinking also about Harriet Tubman and other freedom fighters who were using the stars, because you see, when you see these sprinkled seeds and the seeds are removed and then they go through the photographic process, they get exposed to the sun. Sometimes they're referred to as sun prints. So you're using the nearest star to make, in this case, these stars. I'm thinking about how Harriet Tubman, as an astronomer, looked to the sky to navigate so many unfreed people, or people whose freedoms were taken away because of chattel slavery, navigating their way to the north. And of course, so you see these thousands of pieces of cloth. So ironically, the images before are called monumental cloth, but this project is actually the biggest piece I've ever made, cloth piece I've ever made. It's 1,500 square feet. These pieces of cloth are then sewn together, thousands of them. Each one of them is about 9 by 12 or so. They're sewn together, and Most of them are randomly sprinkled with these seeds to make these stars. Here I'm using those seeds to think about who provides the nourishment for this nation. So not only those who were enslaved in the past, but even migrant workers and the subjugation that they deal with in the present. And then there's some intentional, as you can see on the right, some intentional Big Dippers. So using this asterism or this constellation, which Harriet Tubman and several others used to point north towards freedom, towards the Freedom Star, the North Star. There's several of them in the space. And so what people are doing is you can see that they have flashlights in their hands, and they're looking not only at the piece as a whole, this quilted canopy above our heads, but they're also looking for this asterism of the Big Dipper. Those flashlights that they're holding are blue light flashlights or black light flashlights. And the reason that they're black light flashlights is that when I was working with incarcerated men, they and making some of these pieces, one of them said to me, well, how are you going to light this piece? And, you know, I thought to myself, it's going to a museum. You know, the first time we showed it was in Lancaster, because Lancaster, Pennsylvania was part of the Underground Railroad. And I thought, well, what are you thinking? And he said, well, if you use black light, it'll make the blue more blue and the white more white. So as people are using these flashlights to find their way through this piece, they are guided by the ingenuity of someone who is incarcerated in our system. As they are looking at finding freedom, they are using the light that is in their hands by someone who is unfreed. I often ask people if they would be willing to count the number of stars in this canopy, and people scoff at that because there are so many. But I had a mathematician figure it out with me, and actually the number of stars in this vast piece doesn't even approach the number of people who were forcibly migrated from the continent of Africa and brought to this side of the world in just 3 years in the height of slavery. And so each point becomes a life who was made unfree. Each star is like a light that was made unfree.
I love it. I absolutely love it. And it's not just the intersections of like seeds as potential, but also seeds as guarantee of survival, that kind of braiding into hair,
Yes.
praying that you make it to the next continent. Not only that kind of conversation, but the fact that you created a memorial, if not a monument, to Harriet Tubman that doesn't appropriate her body is so exciting to me. In my writing, a lot of the time I talk about how we are so quick in our society to respond to any kind of societal political issue with the statue of Harriet Tubman specifically, or Martin Luther King Jr., right? It's always their bodies, and it's always their likeness, and it's always the gesture of what they're meant to represent to shut us up and to kind of stop dissent. And I think, you know, I was in Boston the other day and I saw a statue of Harriet Tubman, and I was like, my friend and I stood on the street and we were like, that's not Harriet Tubman. Like, you know, she's too pretty. You know, there's this
she was
beautification.
She was a warrior. Not that warriors can't be pretty, but you know what I mean, right?
It was too washed, and it was so divorced, sanitized. Yeah. It was so divorced from her narrative and what she means to people, especially in communities like where I'm from, that it was just insulting. And to the point where it's like, I don't know how. I've written many pieces on asking people to stop making statues of Harriet Tubman. And right now I live in Philadelphia, where we're voting now on a new statue of Harriet Tubman. And I think that's so funny because she didn't stop here. She kept going. Like, this wasn't her home, you know, but there's something about that is abandoned.
Again and again and again. Like, the fortitude of this woman and she's not the only one. That's the other thing. Like, we hold Harriet Tubman in our minds, but there's so many freedom fighters. You know, she was a spy for the Union. Like, she was an astronomer. The labels I can give Harriet Tubman are endless, right? Endless. And yet there's this sort of sanitization of like the nice Black lady who walked some people to freedom.
And it's infuriating because we live in a time right now where all that she brought to her mission on this earth is what some of us need right now. You know, it's, you know, I love the idea of a kind of monument or a memorial that gives people tools to continue to survive, and not just the like gesture of hope or the gesture, but like literal tools that say, this is how we did it before. You know, we navigated through stars, and that's true for folks who survived marionage. That's true for folks who ran to other countries. You know, even the exodus to Paris is about navigation and about finding safe space. So I love this work. I could talk about it forever. I really could, but
TK, I just want to say, like, I think about who owns space. Like, Jeff Bezos goes up into space, you know, Elon Musk, like, who owns space? And then like this idea of the vastness within us. I often will say the stars in the visible universe, like when you're not in a light polluted city, but you're out in somewhere where there aren't lights pointing towards the sky and you really can see the night sky. It is vast and amazing. And to know that we too are stardust, like we came from that. And to also understand that within us, we have more atoms than the stars that we see in the visible night sky, like that, that we would ever try and oppress each other when that's who we are individually and collectively is one of the things of inhumanity that just astounds me. You know, like each person is so vast and you're going to try and squelch that light. Yes. Anyway, we should move on because we could talk on forever about this.
well, no, I think that's a perfect segue. I think that's a perfect segue to talking about materiality and specifically hair. So y'all, I am obsessed with her use of hair. I think it's amazing and vulnerable. It's vulnerable and it's intimate. It's a very charged material. And of course, you've used lots of charged material. You use sugar, you use copper. But this material specifically, usually you mine from your own body, which, you know, is a kind of, I guess you could say, an endless resource for an artist, but also something that is something that contains the multitudes of that stardust, as you have articulated to me, in a strand.
Yeah, so this piece, Mom's Wisdom or Cotton Candy, is actually my mother's hair, my late mother's hair. And again, she was Jamaican. So the cotton candy is making reference again to sugarcane and the sugarcane industry. But I'm also thinking about how white hair, you know, the Yoruba people in Nigeria and Benin and throughout the Yoruba diaspora will say that white is a color associated with wisdom because your head is your destiny, and it's your identity and your destiny and the seat of your soul. And so when your head extrudes this white hair right before you become an ancestor, then that's a symbol of your wisdom. And so my mother didn't like that I used to work with hair because it's so charged, like it's power. Each strand of hair is all the ancestors that have ever come before you in every strand of hair. And it's also you individually. Simultaneously, it is your individuality and your collective responsibility to all those who have come before you that have made you, right? I mean, just 10 generations back, that's 1,024 people. And then you double it every single time you go back, right? Another generation. So this is so many people in each strand of hair. So my mother would just sort of caution me about working with human hair because I only work with human hair. I know there are a lot of artists who work around hairdressing. And so they'll work with like the hair that we use to to do extensions and that sort of thing. I will use thread for that purpose. If I'm not using actual hair, I'll use thread, but I don't use that like plastic stuff because to me it has no substance, right? And my work, I appreciate it for hairdressing, but I don't appreciate it as a material for me personally to use. So my mother she came around. She started saving her gray hair, so white and black hair for me. And I never made pieces that were for sale with that, but I did separate her, my studio assistant and studio manager and I separated her dark hair from her white hair to preserve her wisdom. And that's what you see here. And I think of hair as being a kind of language. This is just my hair. My hair is quite dark, but so it's not white, it's not wise yet. Maybe one day I'll be so lucky. But I think of hair as being a language. I think of it as being a script. In it is all the voices of all of our ancestors. In it is our potential for who we might be and how we express ourselves to one another. And, you know, when I was a kid, I grew up in DC, as we mentioned earlier, and across the street was the ambassador of Benin, then Dahomey, West African country. And these are Yoruba people as well. Ambassador Ajibade and his family of 14. And my sister and I, my older sister and I would go over across the street and we would inevitably come home with these great hairstyles. So here you see me when I was young and cute, and this hairstyle, it's a little worse for the wear because it's a couple weeks in and I'm coming back from dance class. But having these thread wrapped hairstyles by young aunties or cool teenagers who would turn our hair into artwork, honoring our ori, honoring our destiny. And, you know, this idea of hairstyling as, because we take our hairstyling very seriously, but this idea of hairstyling as not being just about presentation of self and will to adorn, but also a ritual activity. And so on the right, you see images by J.D. Ojikere, who was taking photographs of women in Nigeria and Benin who were getting their hair thread wrapped at the same time that I, as a kid in the 70s, was getting my hair thread wrapped too. So if you don't know J.D. Ojikere's work, I want to make sure that you see his name. I didn't become familiar with him until the 2010s, because that's when a lot of these photographs sort of hit the art market and got into the world in a way. But nonetheless, the artistry that was happening in West Africa was happening on my head because of this, of living in DC and across the street from this ambassador and his family. And so I wanted to make monuments to some of those hairstyles that I had as a child. And so that's what this wig series is me using thread in this case and millinery techniques, hat making techniques to make these wigs, because hairstyles are very ephemeral. You know, you make them and then they last for so long and then they're gone. And I wanted to make pieces that would actually outlive, I mean, these ones now, I made them in 1998 and they're all in museums now. The whole series are in different museums and private collections as a monument to the ritual of hairdressing and the honoring of our destiny and our souls.
If I could ask you, kind of carrying on into the next slide.
Oops. Yeah, this one?
Yeah, that one and further on. But what do you find as an artist, as a material, the malleability, the utility of hair? What does that do for you? How it feels, maybe how it holds smell?
Oh, you know, I don't think about how it holds smell once it's off the body because I have to, you know, I'm usually cleaning it, right? You know, so the thing that usually holds smell is often the products that we put on our hair, actually. But it is true, like it is such an intimate material, you know. I have a friend who says that when she's in between relationships, she goes, you know, she makes sure that she goes to the hairdresser just so she can be touched. And I think about this kind of intimacy as being like, it's hair is both very intimate and very personal and also incredibly collective, right? And that you could take like your hair and my hair, we grow the same kind of hair, TK. But yet if you plucked one of my hairs and you plucked one of your hairs, it might turn out that genetically, even though the curl pattern of our hair is very similar, we actually, your hair might genetically be more connected to someone whose hair is straight and blonde, right? So hair is the thing, because it holds all of our ancestors, that actually holds our humanity. But then because of racial constructs, it's the thing that has separated us. And so to get to this image, which is, I said before that I think of hair as being a kind of script and a kind of language. And I want to sort of point to the idea of the Roman Empire and imperialism, and the way in which there can be tools of imperialism that we sometimes take for granted. And so I came after the Roman alphabet. What you're seeing here in green is all the places where the Roman alphabet has suppressed or erased an indigenous script. And so this is not the places where English is spoken. This is places where the Roman alphabet has been used to repress or replace indigenous scripts, right? So it means that the Roman alphabet holds, on the African continent, holds Wolof or Kikiu or Hausa or Xhosa. It holds all of these languages, and in order for you to be literate in your own language, you have to use the colonizer's script. So I made a script as a kind of freedom that is called twist, that is taking the curl pattern of our hair and turning it into a script. So out of this hairball that you see on the top left, all of those letters from the Roman alphabet are reconfigured as hair. I think of it as sort of like the Black vernacular or the AAVE of the Roman alphabet. And then I also made, so it lives as a digital font. I made it with the help of Bo Peng, who is a graphic designer, because I don't know how to make a digital font and I don't want to learn, but he helped me make it. And then I also worked with Ed Rayer of Swamp Press to make hot lead type. And so these twist collectors boxes, one of them is actually at the Beinecke Library and Museum at Yale, I'm happy to say. There's another, so there's a couple of these out in the world for twist.
It's gorgeous.
Oops. Sorry. What did you want to ask next? Yeah.
I just wanted to say it's gorgeous. And I think that that's a brilliant way of thinking of, or even tapping into the kind of like ingenuity of when language is taken away and language has to be developed, that's mining the self to communicate with others. And there's this beautiful generational thing that happens where you are taught as a child the value, the spiritual worth of hair, and then you're able to imbue that in your work, and you're able to carry that on to us in this conversation. I actually really appreciate that.
I sort of want to uncouple the idea of script from language, because I am using both of those words, but I want to uncouple them. There's a way in which we're so used to seeing the Roman alphabet that when we see another script, we assume it's another language. And again, I'm saying like imperialism erased scripts and said, your scripts don't count, right? First of all, we want you to speak our language, these, as a form of cultural domination. That's one thing. You're going to, like, we're speaking a colonizer's language to one another, right? But to say, like, even if you write in your native tongue, you have to use our script, like the Roman alphabet, to be literate in your own tongue. You still have to go through the lens of the colonizer and this imperialist power to get to your own literacy. I think that is such a detrimental thing. It also means that kinds of wisdoms were lost. And what I love about Twist, which by the way, was named by the brilliant poet laureate Rita Dove. She named it for me. I was calling it the hair font before that, but she named it Twist for me. The Twist says, we're going to reclaim that languages came from Africa. We're going to reclaim that humans came from Africa. We're going to reclaim, right? Yeah.
No, I love it. And you'll have to forgive me, but I'm seeing in the question box, which I encourage you all to start sending your questions now because our time is short.
Yes.
That there are makers watching this now, and they have questions for you. And that kind of segues into my last big question for you. So I'm going to move toward that question, if that's okay.
Yeah.
So y'all are having the same kind of conversations at home, I guess, that I was having with my colleagues at the prospect of this conversation, which is, what do you ask Sonya Clark when you have the opportunity to talk to her? And then also, you know, how do you glean something as a maker, as a cultural producer in these short moments? And I completely understand. So I'm going to try to get to all these questions by framing it within a question of my own. I had the privilege of getting hit up by so many people after I posted this message saying, oh my God, you're talking to Sonya Clark. And she's been so influential to me. She's such a mentor to me. She has taught me so much. And, you know, just to give you those flowers, but also to say, like, flowers received. And that's not just from me, that's from so many young Black makers and cultural producers. But I say that in representing them to say, like, you've spoken already about this beautiful genealogy of care, knowledge, spiritual practice, craft tradition that you've inherited. Can you talk about your inheritance of that kind of knowledge and care, and the ways in which, as an educator, as a maker, that as a community member, that you give those back?
Yeah, I consider it a cycle. I mean, I have not been an artist without being a teacher, and I've never been a teacher without being an artist. So these two things to me are intertwined, and I refuse to get bored, but I never get bored in a classroom. I never get bored when I'm in community. So a classroom, that's a sort of more formal thing as a professor. But when I'm making pieces in community, like the flashlight example that I just gave you, right, with Finding Freedom, the wisdom of the people who are around me make our collective artwork. And I do believe that everything that I make is a collaboration. And I can unpack that a little bit more. I mean, I know that we live in a world where, you know, there's a Sonya Clark artwork, but the ideas that come together in a quote unquote Sonya Clark artwork, first of all, I am a multiplicity of beings that made this Sonya Clark, right? So I already have all my ancestors that I'm working with and then walking with, and that are embodied in me. And then I have the privilege of working with the vastness of community, like a student who has never thread a needle before, but asks a really smart question, you know what I mean? Or you know, the conversations TK, you and I have had in the short time that we've known each other, like these questions and observations, I just love the complexity and the ingenuity that we bring to the world. And I revel in it as an artist. Like this, it all feels like a gift to me. And then a responsibility to do something with that gift. And so I'm going to turn to this piece for a quick second to talk about the gifts that have been given. I love language. I love poets. I wish I were a poet, but alas, I'm a visual artist. So I made this piece called 1877 Hour Curl. I invited 8 femme poets to be part of it. And I asked them if I could take their poems, here you see the name of the poets and their poems, and transliterate them into Twist. And then I made those individual transliterations, and then I printed them on top of each other. And that's what you see here, of them printed one on top of each other. And then I asked the poets if they would read their poems. And I just want you to hear for a brief moment, like the depth of beauty of these Black femme poets reading their poems as you are looking at twist on top of each other in this palimpsest. I'll just play 2 seconds.
When I hear
In letters from somewhere, a little girl
why
is
did you
reading
come like this?
aloud.
In these
What do you want?
A poor child.
She smiles to the sound of her
Do
own
you live in the
voice.
suburbia
To
of free
speak.
Do you have a
I close my eyes.
She feeds on her hunger to
Absence.
absence.
Can I ask?
She has not yet been taught strings. She sits with the stars beneath her.
So that goes on for a while. It's about a 3-minute piece. But I hope that you feel the fullness of all of those people and their ancestors. This piece is not possible without the collaboration. It's not possible without all of those women bringing, all of these Black femme poets bringing the fullness of their humanity, bringing their ancestors with them, and then in the collective chorus, like the strength of that. I don't know where we want to go next. I'm looking at time.
Yeah, and I want to get to, so you have a question from a guest named Justin Allen, who has asked, why did you become an artist?
Oh, that's a small question. So I'll say that when I was in Montessori school, so this is pre-kindergarten, I had my Montessori school teacher. And if you're not familiar with Montessori, it's a way of teaching students that is very experiential. And my teacher happened to also be an artist, and she told my mother, Sonya's a little odd, and she's probably going to be an artist. Now, people say that about kids a lot, that kids are going to be artists, but in this case, she was right. And what I will say is that I had a lot, because I was a good student. I was a good math student. So I had things that were distracting me from art, but then at some point I just reclaimed it as the best way for me to articulate my purpose. And I can't let it go. I don't know how not to think as an artist. I don't know how not to take things in as an artist. And I'm grateful for Mrs. Dennis for seeing that in me, like little 4-year-old Sonya, seeing that she might that she might become an artist. And I'm grateful for the teachers that I've had, the good ones and the bad ones, who have taught me how to be a good teacher, and how to try to keep at this no matter what. Because bad teachers teach you purpose as well as good teachers do. Yeah, so I'm grateful for the support of family and friends and other artists. So many artists who have inspired me. That list is very long in all the fields. I'm married to a musician, so like the arts just live in our household. I think I answered the question. Did I answer that question?
Yeah. I have another one. I'm gonna blend kind of 2 questions, which is when you're sorting out to deciding how you want to approach a question or begin a project, how do you begin the research process? And then also, how do you decide who to collaborate with, or how do you find collaborators?
Oh, so I believe that everything is a collaboration. I'll start there. So even if I am picking up a pen and doodling on a piece of paper, which I've been doing a little bit during this conversation, I can't help it. Like, I didn't design this pen. I didn't put the ink in it. I don't work at the factory that made it. So already just this pen already is a collaboration. And the paper is not handmade paper that I made. It's like paper from my printer, right? So already there are designers, and there's material that's come from Lord only knows where in the world, right? That is already providing the tools for me to do the thing that I'm doing. And then again, as a human being, I consider myself a collaboration. Where ideas come from and where research starts. Sometimes it starts with the materiality of something. Sometimes I'm just engaged. Like I'll be making work around hair forever because I feel like it's such a rich territory to continue to mine. But sometimes I have an idea and it sits waiting for the right material to hold it, right? And sometimes it can be something as generous as an observation of how people are with each other in an airport, like a tender moment or a non-tender moment. And I think, like, how can I bring that into a reflection of who and how we are in the world with each other? And sometimes it's something that I'm reading in a book, and now we have all these search engines. So you begin with an idea and then you say, well, what's the etymology of that word? Or how was that thing made? And where are those things made? And as I'm picking up these seeds of things, then I'm planting a little garden to figure out what might grow into the next artwork. So it happens both ways, both from the material, both from the ideas in conversation and the richness of the books that I'm reading, or the art that I'm taking in, or just in being part of the world and with fresh and open eyes and seeing how we are with each other. All of those things. I know it's not helpful to say the inspiration comes from everywhere.
No, I love that. And it's a perfect segue into this, into kind of bringing us to a close. One of the things that has permeated through this conversation, which I think is something essential to continue to permeate into your lives, is that no boat is kept afloat by just the captain. And nothing, absolutely nothing in this world, in our existence, is done in isolation. The myth of like a genius artist or someone being able to do anything alone. I can't eat without the cooperation of hundreds of thousands of people.
Exactly.
Like, you know what I mean? It's
Yeah.
all a collaboration. And I think that's the beautiful juxtaposition of seeing the monumental cloth work right next to the mini cloth work, because so many minis make a monumental. And I want to ask, the We Are Each Other, the new catalog that has come out, the new book that is being published with this mid-career survey. Could you talk about the inspiration from that title and kind of talk us through where that came from?
So I know we just have a few more minutes. I'm going to actually address this image. This is me dressed as Ella Watson, if that name is not familiar. You will be in a moment. And I'm cleaning a floor. So I'm working as a domestic laborer, sort of collapsing my identity with the identity of many women who have come before me, who have provided the space for me to be the educated person that I am, living in the economic comfort that I live as a middle-class person, all of those spaces. As I'm dressed in this way and cleaning this dirty floor, which is revealing the dirty text of the Declaration of Independence. This is Ella Watson. This is my monument to Ella Watson. So this idea of me embodying something of who she was and centering her is something that I also think about when I was making, putting together the show, We Are Each Other. I'm going to skip over the image of Sam Gilliam. I feel terrible about that, but I want to get to We Are Each Other. The show We Are Each Other is named for the relationship between two incredible artists, Gwendolyn Brooks, a poet laureate, Pulitzer Prize winner. I can't say enough about Gwendolyn Brooks, and Paul Robeson, who was an activist, an artist, a singer, and both of them used their stage to do the work of combating anti-racism, celebrating Blackness, celebrating Black culture. Gwendolyn Brooks wrote this poem in honor of Paul Robeson. And the final lines have this beautiful repetition. We are each other's harvest. We are each other's business. We are each other's magnitude and bond. And then you see it written in twist, which of course you're all familiar with now as well. And that led me to name this show We Are Each Other. This idea that nothing happens in the singular, everything happens in the collective. And the artwork that is in this exhibition, it's a little bit of a misnomer for it to say Sonya Clark, We Are Each Other. It's also a little bit of a misnomer to call it my 60th solo show, which I do myself, but in fact, there's so many projects in this show, every project in the show has had a multiplicity of hands working on it in some way or another. So I do think of this as being the biggest group show I've ever been in. It's no exaggeration to say that thousands and thousands of people, not an exaggeration at all, thousands and thousands of people have had a hand in making We Are Each Other. And so it is with that great privilege of celebrating our collective humanity, celebrating the multiple cultures that we belong to and the multiple identities that we belong to, and doing that through the artwork.
Sonya, thank you so much. We are out of time.
I know. It went by really quickly, and I
went by so
appreciate.
fast.
Are there any last questions that we want to address? They said we could have a little bit of wiggle room.
A little time? Okay.
Yeah. Jane
We
said
got
have like 4 more minutes, I think.
if y'all want to stick with us, we have I feel like a thick one here. Is there a difficulty to leaving an object within its blighted history and placing or translating the object into a new context? Is it a difficult line for the effect of the piece?
So I do believe that an artist has intent, and then the artwork lives its own life. So I cannot be prescriptive about how people are going to perceive my work. I can only be intentional about how I'm making the work. And this is what I feel very strongly about with artwork. I make the work, I have a relationship to it as an artist. That artwork can change and evolve my relationship to it as I change and evolve. So even my relationship with my intent as an artist changes with a piece that I've made 20 years ago, as opposed to 2 years ago, as opposed to a moment ago, right? We grow together and we learn from each other, the artwork and I. Likewise with the audience, I think that art has the ability to be like a slick surface, like a mirrored surface that reflects us back at ourselves in that moment. And I also believe that the artwork has this capaciousness that it can hold all of our stories collectively. And that makes it an incredible responsibility and an incredible field to work in. I hope that answers that question.
And if I could add on to that, just as a curator, some artworks, and not necessarily in materiality, but are ephemeral in the way that they resonate through time. Sometimes you've created something as a maker or as a cultural producer that just rings so true across so many levels and planes and piers and pierces into so many people in that moment that could not have happened in another political, cultural, social, geographical place. And when you take one object from one museum to another museum, from a museum to a home, from a home to a hospital, sometimes these different spaces completely impact what the work even means. Sometimes even the cotton in the US, in the South, means something different than cotton in Egypt, and cotton in Egypt means something different than cotton in Japan. You have to deal with the constant intersections of what's impacting the meaning of the work and allow it to live without you, because it will continue on without you in the world as it circulates.
Yeah, that context is everything. Everything. Yeah. I appreciate that. And I appreciate the question. And now I think we really are out of time. But I'm glad we snuck that last question in there. I think that was a really powerful question. I appreciate the audience. Those of you we can't see, but we see you, we feel the love. TK, it's so much gratitude to you. And like I said, the beginning of a beautiful friendship. So
absolutely. I will see you in Atlanta at the opening of We Are Each Other.
And also you all in New York, the We Are Each Other is going to be in New York. It opens on March 23rd, which is my birthday, at the Museum of Arts and Design. So it's going to Atlanta first, those of you who are joining us from that area. And then for those of you who are in New York or in the New York area, I hope to see you in the spring of 2024. Thank you so much.
All right. And thank you to the Yale Center for British Arts.
Yes. All right.
Bye now.